My name is Cheryl Crisp. I'm the National Secretary of the SEP, and I'll be chairing today's meeting. The meeting is titled, After Smeaton Grange Workers Reject Union Sellout, the Way Forward for Coles and Woolworths Workers. As I said, it's hosted by the SEP and the World Socialist website to discuss the situation which confronts Coles, Woolworths and other sections of warehouse workers. And most importantly, what perspective needs to be adopted to take this struggle forward. But I think before we do, it is necessary to place this struggle in its context. We are now a year on from the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. In 1 year, there is now 106 million people who are infected and 2.3 million dead. For those who declare that this is a natural or only a medical emergency, that is really a cover for the real responsibility for this tragic and catastrophic situation. In the United States, the richest and most powerful country on earth, with the most billionaires, its death toll is equivalent to almost 1.5 times the toll of 9/11 every single day. In the first month of 2021, double the number of American casualties in the entire Vietnam War have died from COVID-19. This is the result not just of a virus, but it is a great indictment of capitalism, and it is the result of the conscious government policies of every government throughout the world. And that policy is herd immunity. The fact that workplaces such as schools, colleges, warehouses, meat packing and other factories, including hospitals, are the main source of infection for workers is a price the capitalist governments and the ruling class are willing to pay. In fact, it is a price that they are insisting on to ensure the drive to maintain profits and production. Nothing must interfere with that priority. It is the acceleration of these conditions which we have described as a trigger event analogous to the outbreak of World War I, exacerbating the already existing contradictions of capitalism, which itself is the driving force to the turn to fascist forms of rule, as seen on January the 6th, when President Trump, the then President Trump, incited extreme right-wing layers, including militias both in and outside the military, the police, the state apparatus, to invade the Capitol building, take hostages, and possibly kill some of them as the lever to overturn the election itself. While this took place in America, it is by no means an American phenomenon. It is only the sharpest expression of the turn by the capitalist class internationally. In Australia, the infection and death rate is much lower, but it would be very mistaken to conclude that the attitude of this government is fundamentally different. The fact that Prime Minister Morrison in March 2020 suspended Parliament, the first in the world to do so, established the National Cabinet, ruled through a virtual government of national unity, including the Labor states, is because of the profound weakness of the coalition government itself. I mean, let's remember that in January of last year, only 1 month before the outbreak of infections here, Morrison couldn't show his face in the bushfire devastated areas. Had there been an election in early 2020, the government would have undoubtedly fallen. So hated was he and his government because of their criminal inaction and indifference to climate change. Once, of course, the bushfires developed, the worst in history, then their inaction, their refusal to really undertake any sort of measures, and the result of their previous policies were evident for all to see. They have, since the lockdowns of March 2020, attempted to limit any restrictions on production and profit. What they have also done, with the willing cooperation of Labor and the ACTU, with Sally McManus at its head, is to engage in a sweeping restructure of class relations in this country, which the Coles and Woolworths agenda is a part. Already working hours, penalty rates, and wage rates have been radically altered in the year during the pandemic. But that's not enough. The billions of dollars handed over to big business by the government in the form of the stimulus packages now has to be paid back. That will be done by gouging the remaining conditions of workers and then accelerating productivity levels. Negotiations between the ACTU and business groups have been conducted and are continuing to deepen these attacks. There is a social catastrophe being prepared in this country. At present, 21.4% of the workforce are unemployed or underemployed. That is 3.1 million workers. There are still 1.5 million workers on JobKeeper who are going to be thrown off by the end of March. Virgin, Telstra, Qantas and other major employers have already foreshadowed mass sackings with the ending of JobKeeper. The moratorium on rent evictions has now been lifted, which will mean the thousands of people unable to pay their rent could be thrown onto the streets. It is why our warning that the attack on the Coles workers, unless defeated, will be one imposed on broader sections of workers. It will become a blueprint for the implementation of mass job cuts, destruction of what is left of working class rights, increased casualisation of the workforce, and for the young, little or no prospects for secure and permanent work. For younger people who have had to put their lives on hold during the pandemic, this is a prospect which is being made increasingly permanent. One thing which has become clear in the course of the pandemic is that supermarkets, their warehouses which supply them, and their staff are essential services and therefore essential workers, just as workers in health, quarantine hotels, postal services, and actually teachers are. This is why so much effort and, quite frankly, ruthlessness has been expended by the company and the unions to shut this struggle down. Already, workers in Coles have informed us that in the last days at Eastern Creek, productivity levels have been almost doubled. Casuals are being inducted and employed, a very unusual event for this time of year, and an extra 300 product lines added to the inventory that workers have to deal with. Without being able to state categorically, one could deduce from this that Coles intends to extend the lockout and other warehouses will be forced to deal with the load. Other unconfirmed information from Coles workers is that there is a new Coles offer being put forward. It is one which is identical to the one that was voted down on Tuesday, and except for the provision that was offered in the initial deal that if workers accepted their offer, that they would be given a free lunch. This has been replaced, instead of a free lunch, with $1,000. It is a clear attempt to just pay off workers under conditions where they have been starved over the past almost 12 weeks by the refusal of the union to carry out a strike fund. The courageous and self-sacrificing stand of the Coles workers is to be hailed and commended. It is, however, the beginning of a new stage in this struggle, one which requires a new approach, a new perspective, and that is a political perspective, a socialist one. And it is that which we want to discuss today. We have two speakers that will present remarks to you, And after that, we will open up for questions and answers. The first is Jim Franklin, who is an Australia Post worker, a member of the Postal Workers Rank and File Committee, and one of the workers and the Australia Post staff who gave interviews of support to the Smeaton Grange workers. These statements, as all of the comments by teachers, academic staff, students, were not elicited by their unions or by the UWU, but by the World Socialist website. And this is how the vast majority of workers outside of Smeaton Grange have learnt about the Coles lockout. So I'd like you to give him a warm welcome, if you could, but nevertheless, give him a warm response to his remarks. So I'll leave it to Jim.
Thank you, Comrade Cheryl. And I'd like to welcome all to this meeting. As Cheryl stated, I'm a member of the Postal Workers Rank and File Committee. And I want to start by saying that our Rank and File Committee last week passed a motion in support of the locked out Smeaton Grange workers, and we said the following. This inaugural meeting of the Postal Workers Rank and File Committee sends its full support to our brothers and sisters locked out at Coles Smeaton Grange. We call on workers there to vote no and oppose the sellout deal the United Workers Union leadership and Coles is attempting to force you to accept. We urge our fellow workers to also establish an independent rank and file committee separate from the union and management and seek to broaden your fight by winning support from fellow workers throughout the country and amongst other sections of workers. The Postal Workers Rank and File Committee will fight with you and do everything in our power to help you defeat the attempt of the union to sabotage your fight against the company. That was the resolution we passed. Workers at Smeaton Grange last Tuesday, against enormous pressure from both the company and the union, voted against the company-backed union deal to return to work, thus revealing the determination of the workers to defend their interests. This is a courageous stand taken by the Smeaton Grange workers. It is clearly having a major impact on workers everywhere. Workers are drawing the conclusion that they must fight against the pro-big business restructuring at Smeaton Grange, but also in every industry. The United Workers Union, UWU leadership, is doing everything in its power to sabotage this struggle by refusing strike pay to starve out the workers and refusing to call out other Coles workers anywhere in order to isolate these workers. This is a union that says it has 150,000 members and obviously has a great deal of resources at its disposal. But all of this has come to naught. The perspective of the union is to cajole the workers back to work on the company's terms and ensure the orderly closure of Smeaton Grange. When we look at Smeaton Grange and what the union is doing, the same can be said about the situation at Australia Post and almost every other section of the working class, as employers everywhere use the pandemic to undertake far-reaching restructuring. Under the guise of the pandemic health crisis, the Morrison government in April last year advanced changes to the legislation, reducing the frequency of letter deliveries and allowing Australia Post management to undertake long-held plans for restructuring. The Communication Plumbers and Electrical Union, CEPU, and the Communication Workers Union, CWU, which cover postal workers, undertook a bogus campaign directing workers to put their faith in the Senate to block the changes, while at the same time, they carried out closed-door discussions with then Australia Post CEO, Christine Holgate. The unions, in close collaboration with both the government and Australia Post management, signed a memorandum of understanding with Holgate in July last year, giving the green light for the restructuring to proceed unopposed. The alternative delivery model, or ADM as it's called, is the name of this restructuring at Australia Post. The purpose of this restructuring is to position Australia Post to take advantage of the booming parcel delivery market, increase its efficiency to better compete against its rivals in this lucrative market, and to create the best conditions for the government to eventually privatise Australia Post. But what does this mean for postal workers? And what has been the outcome so far? The ADM has dramatically increased the exploitation of postal workers. Posties have been forced out of their delivery route, which in many cases they carried out for years, and they have been forced to take on two separate alternating delivery routes instead of one, having to slot and deliver double mail volumes every day. Many posties have been cajoled by management to transition to parcel delivery in vans, having to meet quotas set by management in collaboration with the union. Customer complaints have dramatically increased, and there are huge backlogs of both parcels and letters that can't be delivered due to lack of staff. While Australia Post hired thousands of casuals over the peak Christmas period, they have now all been laid off again, increasing the burden on existing staff. A whole layer of postal workers called floaters, because they don't have designated routes and are shunted from one place to another, are workers who have little seniority and are on fixed term contracts. They face the threat of losing their jobs once their arrangements run out. The plans of management to initially lay off around a quarter of all postal delivery workers, around 2,200 jobs, was temporarily put on hold. But part of this job destruction is being achieved by forcing many long-standing posties to quit due to the increased level of exploitation that is now taking place. Once the ADM is reviewed in June, there is no guarantee that further job cuts will not take place. We are noticing that the ad hoc nature of the way this restructuring has been imposed is resulting in significant increases in many types of injuries, from minor strains and soft tissue to mental stress, as well as more serious injuries due to fatigue and exhaustion. All of this is being covered up by the unions. Their main role since the restructuring began is to function as advisors to management to work out the best way to implement the ADM. They have told workers to participate in the joint pro-company union working groups in order to defend workers' conditions. These corporatist organisations are in fact the mechanism through which management and the unions are introducing the ADM and forcing workers to accept it. The truth is, the unions are not doing anything different to what they have carried out for years at Australia Post and elsewhere, overseeing the destruction of thousands of jobs and the constant lowering of the conditions and wages through negotiating rotten enterprise agreements. The same unions that cover Australia Post, for example, also cover Telstra. Telstra announced in 2018 the T22 restructuring, which reported that an estimated 8,000 jobs would be cut by 2022. The response of the unions at the time was to tell workers to sign a worthless petition and complain to their local member. While there was a moratorium on job cuts from March last year, Telstra has announced just now that the job destruction will resume with over 1,400 jobs to go this year. The unions have done nothing to unite both posties and Telstra workers in a common fight against these massive cuts and the restructuring, even though they're part of the same union. The CEPU and the CWU signed a memorandum of understanding knowing full well that if they had taken the step to inform their members of this deal, they would have met massive opposition and would not have been able to implement the restructuring. The union now says there's nothing we can do and the restructuring has to be accepted. The excuse the union gave to us was they had to sign to save jobs, but the union didn't consult the members. It didn't call a mass meeting to discuss this and allow the workers to decide if they were going to accept this massive attack on their working conditions. This highlights the correctness of the position of the Socialist Equality Party, that there is no workers' democracy in the unions. These are not workers' organisations, but pro-corporate instruments of management used to dupe workers and impose the big business program of the corporations. This is the stock in trade of the unions everywhere. Workers at Smeaton Grange are being told by the union, this is the deal and there's nothing you can do about it, and you have to accept it. The fact is, the unions at Australia Post have said nothing or written nothing about the attack on Smeaton Grange workers. The ACTU, the main union body, has said nothing about Australia Post or Smeaton Grange and left them to rot. However, postal workers are starting to recognise they cannot defend their conditions within the framework of the unions. This is why they are starting to seek new organisations of struggle and why we have established our rank and file committee. The only way to defeat the ADM and the attacks on our conditions is to build rank and file committees that are independent of the unions, management and the government. We call on workers at Smeaton Grange to draw the same conclusions we have and to take up this fight, build independent rank and file committees and join with us in this struggle. We will do everything we can to support you and help form such organisations. We call on workers throughout the distribution sector and beyond to join this fight and break the isolation at Smeaton Grange, which the unions have imposed. If you agree with this perspective, then we urge you to take up this fight in your workplace and community and join us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. The final speaker today is Oscar Grenfell. Oscar's name, I'm sure, is well known to many who read the World Socialist website and who follow the analysis that he undertakes in his role as a writer for the WSWS. He's a member of the National Committee of the SEP, and he's also the convener of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the IYSSE, the SEP's youth movement. He has been the author of numbers of the articles that we have posted in defence of the Coles workers, of the Smeaton Grange workers, and also to draw out, and he has drawn out, the role of the union, the role of all the trade unions, and has fought for an analysis of the relationship of this struggle to other disputes and struggles which workers are undertaking both here and internationally. Please give Oscar a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thanks to everyone taking part in this discussion. In a statement on January the 27th, the Socialist Equality Party raised that the dispute at Smeaton Grange had reached a decisive turning point. The United Workers Union, having isolated the workers for more than 10 weeks of a company lockout, was trying to ram through a sellout agreement in an official ballot last Tuesday. The deal pushed by the UWU gave Coles everything that it demanded: an orderly shutdown of the warehouse, the destruction of most or all of the 350 jobs there, redundancies capped at 80 weeks past employment, meaning that workers would be denied recompense for years or even decades on the job, a 3.5% per annum wage rise in the meantime after 2 months of no pay, and no right to redeployment at the new automated facility that is to replace Smeaton Grange. Workers were presented with an agreement virtually identical to ones they'd rejected 5 times before, and they were told by the union that they had no choice but to accept it. This can only be described as a calculated exercise in blackmail. The UWU was trying to exploit the financial hardship of workers that the union itself is centrally responsible for to push through a yes vote on the sellout agreement. The union was well aware that many workers, having been denied strike pay by the UWU throughout the lockout, are facing the real prospect of being pauperised. Some have found work elsewhere, others have been forced to use tens of thousands of dollars of their savings to survive. Some workers, close to retirement age, have told the WSWS that they've completely exhausted their superannuation during the lockout. The vote last Tuesday was a turning point in several senses. The UWU had taken its attempts to bludgeon workers into accepting Coles' demands to a new level. If workers had been compelled to ratify the agreement, it would have been a return to work on management's terms. Redundancies sackings would have followed immediately as workers were thrown on the scrap heap and Smeaton Grange rapidly closed. This would have set a blueprint for orderly union-enforced shutdowns at 4 other Coles warehouses slated for closure over the next 4 years, as well as 4 Woolworths plants. And it would have been a signal for an even greater acceleration of a pro-business restructuring that is taking place throughout the economy, involving mass job destruction, wage cuts, and a continuous assault on working conditions. We emphasised in our January 27th SEP statement that a rejection of the deal would have no less far-reaching ramifications. It would not only represent a stand by the Smeaton Grange workers on behalf of their own jobs and conditions, but those of warehouse workers throughout the industry and more broadly. And that's what took place. The no vote in the ballot that was held last Tuesday, under conditions where everything was done by the union to force through the sellout, was of immense significance. It's part of a re-emergence of the class struggle internationally and shows the determination of workers to fight the dictates of the major corporations and their chief enforcers, the trade unions. But this is only the beginning. Coles still plans to shut Smeaton Grange, and the union will respond to the no vote by redoubling its efforts to push through a sellout agreement. Immense pressure will be placed on workers to accept a deal so that they can return to their jobs when the lockout is set to end on February the 11th. And even if there is a return to work without an agreement, the imminent prospect of mass redundancies remains. We've stressed that the only way this struggle can go forward is through a complete break with the UWU and all of the unions and the establishment of independent rank and file committees at Smeaton Grange, at all other Coles and Woolworths warehouses, and at workplaces more broadly. The experiences of the past several months have again demonstrated that a fight to defend jobs is a fight against the union, which is the main police force of Coles and the other major companies. It's worth reviewing just briefly what the strategy of the union has been during the Smeaton Grange dispute and the tactics that it's employed to achieve it. For months before the lockout was imposed in November, the UWU had been in backroom negotiations with Coles executives for a new enterprise agreement covering Smeaton Grange. The starting point for the union was complete agreement that the warehouse would be closed and the jobs destroyed. All that the union raised was bogus rhetoric about a quote-unquote just transition, a fair redundancy, and a chance of redeployment. And now it's dropped even that posturing. But I think the crucial point is that throughout the dispute, the union has explicitly opposed any struggle against the closure and in defence of jobs. Now, how has the UWU gone about this? First of all, the union did nothing to obstruct the lockout. The company had clearly prepared for this for weeks and possibly months. It had shifted production to other facilities ahead of time, and when the lockout was announced, 2 so-called pop-up warehouses in Western Sydney were ready to take on work that had been carried out previously at Smeaton Grange. It's inconceivable that the UWU was not aware of these preparations for a lockout. Workers had raised their fears with the union that if they took part in a 24-hour strike in November as part of the enterprise agreement dispute, they would be locked out. But UWU officials told them that Coles would never do such a thing over the busy Christmas period. Secondly, the union has isolated workers throughout the lockout. It's refused to organise action at any other Coles warehouse or facility, ensuring that the company's operations and its massive profits have been unaffected. Workers at Coles warehouses in Brisbane and Melbourne have told SEP campaigners over the past 2 weeks that they didn't even know there was a lockout in Sydney. The UWU has held no general meetings to alert workers to what has been carried out. Thirdly, as we mentioned earlier, the union has literally tried to starve the Smeaton Grange workers into submission by denying them strike pay. When the UWU was founded in 2019, through the amalgamation of the National Union of Workers and United Voice, It was billed as a new super union that would supposedly take on wage theft, casualisation, and other attacks on workers. We made a very different assessment, publishing an article on the formation of the UWU, which was headlined, "Another Super Union Merger, a Bigger Industrial Policeman." The union, which claims 150,000 dues-paying members, has no strike fund whatsoever. In meetings with delegates, UWU executives have cried poor, claiming that the organisation simply does not have the resources to cover wages during a strike or lockout, and that it would have to impose a substantial levy on all of its members if strike pay was to be given. We'll write further on this over the coming days, but the union's own submission to the Registered Organisations Commission for the last financial year tells a different story. The UWU reported an intake of 49.9 million from membership fees over 12 months. The union's other income was listed as 201 million, including from investments, interest, and 198 million worth of assets brought together during the amalgamation. The UWU's total assets stood at 300.8 million, including 94.2 million in cash holdings. Now, there's no breakdown of the salaries of the different officials, but in the space of 12 months, the union reported spending $48.6 million on employee expenses. In other words, the union is a substantial business in its own right. In addition to protecting the privileges of the UWU bureaucracy, the refusal to establish a strike fund is a deliberate tactic to prevent workers taking any action. And this is not an issue that's just limited to Smeaton Grange. The union has presented the lockout there as an isolated dispute, but this is completely false. In reality, the attempt to close Smeaton Grange is part of a sweeping restructure being implemented by Coles and Woolworths with the crucial assistance of the unions. In 2018, both companies outlined major plans to modernise their warehousing and distribution networks. At Coles, 5 existing facilities have been earmarked for closure since that time. In addition to Smeaton Grange, which has 350 workers, they're the Eastern Creek National Distribution Centre in Western Sydney, which is staffed by at least 700 permanent and casual workers, the Goulburn Warehouse with at least 250 workers, and the Heathwood and Forest Lake facilities in Brisbane, which employ more than 1,000 staff. Workers at 2 Melbourne warehouses have also been told that they face job cuts as a result of automation. In other words, we're talking about at least 2,200 jobs being destroyed across Coles warehouses in the next few years. Now, Coles has not indicated how many workers the 2 new automated facilities, one in Sydney and one in Brisbane, will employ, but the company executives have pitched the restructure to investors as a major cost-cutting program. The model is Amazon and similar operations that combine the latest advances in technology with a small, highly casualised workforce, often employed through labour hire companies and paid the minimum wage or close to it. What Woolworths is carrying out gives an indication of Coles' plans. Woolworths is preparing to shut 4 warehouses at Minchinbury and Yennora in Sydney, Wyong on the New South Wales Central Coast, and Mulgrave in Melbourne. In their place will be just 2 automated facilities in the Sydney suburb of Moorebank. All 1,300 workers in the existing warehouses are facing the sack, with Woolworths saying that the Moorebank operation, set to open in 2025, will require only 650 permanent workers. Now, if you bring the various closures together, Coles, Woolworths, and the unions are engaged in an operation that can only be compared to the shutdown of the car industry. Last decade, having already overseen thousands of job cuts, the unions pushed through the closures of the General Motors Holden plant in Adelaide, Ford in the Melbourne suburb of Broadmeadows and in Geelong, and Toyota also in Melbourne. The Australian Workers' Union ensured that there were no strikes and no struggle whatsoever. Like at Coles and Woolworths, the union insisted that the jobs were going, and the only issue was a so-called just transition. What have been the consequences of this? Well, at the GM Holden plant in the Adelaide suburb of Elizabeth, the consequences have been catastrophic. That plant was shut in 2017. In November 2019, that is 2 years later, there was a survey of 950 workers who had been employed there. The survey found that 23% were still unemployed. While 76.4% of the workers had found jobs, 2/3 of these were in precarious, lower paying part-time and casual employment. And for younger workers in Elizabeth and other working class suburbs, there's simply no prospect of ever finding a permanent full-time job with decent wages and conditions. This experience, replicated in one industry after another, has important lessons for Coles and Woolworths workers. A genuine struggle means a fight to defend all of the jobs. This cannot be carried out at one warehouse. It requires a unified movement across the sector, but that in turn depends on the establishment of rank and file committees. What would such committees do? Firstly, these committees must be entirely independent of and separate from the unions. They would facilitate a democratic discussion among all workers who want to fight the union company attacks, free of the interference and intimidation of the UWU officials and their lackeys. Second, these committees would ensure that all Coles and Woolworths workers know what is taking place. Everything that the union and the company are doing is based on suppressing information, covering up their sordid manoeuvres, and keeping workers in the dark. In the United States, rank and file committees initiated by our party publish weekly newsletters that are read by tens of thousands of auto workers, teachers, and others. And thirdly, such committees would turn to all warehouse and retail workers nationally who face similar sackings. Big W and Target, for instance, have already announced the closure of dozens of stores. They would organise industrial and political actions in defence of threatened workers, win support from their class brothers and sisters internationally, and raise financial support from workers throughout the country. A nationwide strike of Coles, Woolworths, and other warehouse workers would have a massive impact, would rapidly bring the operations of both companies to a halt and serve as a rallying point for the working class as a whole. But this is a political fight. Any action taken by workers will immediately come up against not only the companies, but the government, the corporate media, the UWU, the other unions, and the Labor Party. All of them use the framework of Fair Work Australia industrial legislation, which was introduced by the last Labor government with the full support of the unions to intimidate workers with the threat of massive fines and even criminal prosecution for any collective action. And enterprise bargaining, brought in by Labor and the unions in the 90s, has been used to divide workers up, factory by factory, to prevent any industry-wide struggle and to force through one sellout enterprise agreement after another. Here we have a graph just pointing to the consequences of this regime enforced by Labor and the unions. The blue line shows the average number of working days lost from strikes each year over the 2 decades to 2018. You can see a continuous decline, and the red line demonstrates that this suppression of the class struggle has been used to drive down workers' pay and conditions. It shows average wage growth, which has now declined to record lows. This whole framework associated with fair work and enterprise bargaining can't be defeated by one section of workers alone. It requires a political movement of the working class as a whole. That's why we're stressing the need for Coles and Woolworths workers to turn to Australia Post staff who are facing a major union-enforced restructure and the threat of privatisation, airline workers who are being hit by mass job cuts, Telstra employees, where another 1,400 sackings have been confirmed, and to other key sections of workers. There's a growing desire to fight and a mood of opposition, but it requires new organisations, that is independent rank and file committees, to bring these different layers of the working class together in a common struggle. And above all, a new political perspective is needed. The unions are nationalist and pro-capitalist organisations. They defend the current social order, which subordinates everything to the profit interests of the corporations, the banks, and the ultra-wealthy. Under conditions of globally mobile capital, the union's old national reformist program of seeking limited concessions from individual employers has lost any viability. They've responded by transforming themselves into an industrial police force of management committed to wage cuts and job destruction. We're not calling for the establishment of new and more militant unions. What we're raising is the necessity for genuine organisations of struggle linked to the fight for workers' governments and for socialism. This issue is posed directly by the dispute at Smeaton Grange itself. The company, the unions, and the entire political establishment insist that the closure is inevitable because of automation. But the issue is not automation per se, but which class oversees and benefits from it. Under capitalism, developments in productivity are always used to reduce labour costs to drive up profits. The alternative is not to try to turn back the clock of technological development or return to a mythical age of national regulation. The advances in automation could be used to shorten the working day without any reduction in wages and to strengthen health, safety, and other conditions. In other words, these advances could be used to improve the lives of workers, their families, and society at large. But this will only take place if the major corporations and the banks are placed under public ownership and democratic workers' control. The immense wealth that's produced by the working class needs to be taken out of the hands of the billionaires who have made more money during the past year than ever before. Production must be organised to meet social need, not private profit. That's the perspective of international socialism that the SEP is fighting for, and it's the only means of guaranteeing the fundamental social rights of the working class, including to a permanent full-time job for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Oscar. I think that was very clear and very helpful, and I'm sure out of both contributions there will be many questions or comments, and we do encourage anybody in the audience to post a comment in the chat, ask a question, and obviously it does not have to solely be on the question of Smeaton Grange or Coles. If there's any questions about any aspect of our analysis on the World Socialist website by the Socialist Equality Party, please feel free to ask. While I'm allowing you to organise your thoughts, I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of pamphlets that we will have available through Meering Books. The first one is Marxism and the Trade Unions, and this is a pamphlet of a lecture which was delivered by Comrade David North, who is the international editor of the chairman of the International Editorial Board, and also of the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. What this pamphlet does is outline the objective basis for the betrayal of the trade unions. I mean, we discuss many times the role of the unions, we indict the unions, but this is not the result of the individual leaders, organisers, those who make up the administration. It emerges out of the very essence, the essential nature of the trade unions themselves, by their acceptance of the framework of capitalism, which itself becomes the mechanism whereby the requirements of capitalism therefore are imposed against the working class. This is available, as I said, from Meering Books, which you can get by emailing sales@meering.com.au, and it's $5. The other publication which I'd like to draw your attention to is the Industrial Relations and the Trade Unions under Labor, from Whitlam to Rudd. And this is a publication that was written by Comrade Nick Beams, who needs no introduction to our audience, I'm sure. And what it does is outlines the record of betrayal of the trade unions, but also by the Labor leadership. And it, as it says, as the headline and the title says, from Whitlam to Rudd. So it begins with a history of the Labor governments which came to power in 1972, and ends with the coming to power of the Rudd government in 2007. And it particularly highlights the role of the unions under the Hawke-Keating governments, which themselves were the mechanism in this country for carrying out the measures against the destruction of the conditions of the working class, of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs in manufacturing, the very organisations of the working class, with the full collaboration and support of the unions. In fact, in this country, it was the Hawke-Keating regime that carried through the same policies as that of Thatcher in Britain and Reagan in the United States. And we have raised many times since that many of the mechanisms and impositions which are being carried out in France, in European countries, enterprise bargaining, the attacks against the conditions and rights of the working class, they have been in existence here for many decades, and they were implemented by Labor governments through the Accords, in particular with Hawke and Keating, with the complete collaboration and support of the unions. And many of the legislation, anti-strike legislation, against the rights of workers to carry out industrial action, were initiated in this period and by Labor governments. So that is also $5, and I would urge everybody to, if you haven't got these publications, to get them. Okay, so we have some questions. So from Ryan, if they were, I presume Ryan means Coles workers, if they were to make a rank and file committee, how exactly would it work? How would it function? And what is its purpose? An excellent question. Robert, I'm on a good analysis, comrades. I'm on a packed bus, so can't ask a question over microphone. What would the SEP's response be on rank and file committees being formed within the UWU and across other unions under one banner? That is, members first, workers first. The problem would be a campaigning one with the workers, I feel, who would be in two minds about leaving their union after 11 weeks of being locked out. I completely agree on the analysis that points out the complicity of the UWU in the lockout. Another question, I mean, I'll raise these because they're all related. From Pietro, how does one go about creating a rank and file committee? Tim, what is a rank and file committee? What are their roles? So they are all very good questions. And so I'll hand it over to either Jim or Oscar to open up and answer those questions.
Oh, well, Cheryl, maybe I'll try and answer some of those questions up first up. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so what is a rank and file committee? Well, our conception of a rank and file committee is that under conditions where workers confront a trade union bureaucracy in every area that refuses not only to not fight for the interests of workers, but also collaborates with management. The role of a rank and file committee is to organise workers independently of these organisations, of management, of government in order to put forward their, workers' class interests. That is, we certainly fight for all the gains and conditions that workers have established over a very long period of time, which are now being eroded and destroyed. But we oppose the mechanisms by which the union is now utilising, along with their supporters, to undermine those conditions. However, our perspective isn't a union perspective. It's not better trade unionism. Our perspective is a socialist perspective, which comes to the question as to how does one go about, creating a rank and file committee. Well, to be honest, we formed our rank and file committee at Australia Post, and one of the biggest impetuses to that was when members of the Socialist Equality Party came to Australia Post and handed out the analysis and perspective that was presented on the World Socialist website of the attacks and role of the trade unions. That is, it provided a political alternative. And really, I think very much that, rank and file committees have to put forward a socialist perspective, an alternative to the betrayals of the unions, because behind what the unions do is a political perspective. It's to tie workers to the capitalist system. They defend capitalism. They organise on behalf of capitalism. They, divert the struggles of workers, for example, like they did at Australia Post, behind the parliamentary system, behind the Labor Party. We've got to force these people to do something. It's a completely bankrupt perspective, because all these political organisations, are tied to and wedded to the defence of capitalism, and under conditions, as Cheryl went through in her opening remarks, where the bourgeoisie is now undertaking, and facing the biggest crisis of its rule in history, and driving as deeply as they can to extract every ounce of surplus value and profit from workers. They must carry out these attacks, and the unions play a central role in that. So our role, and I think Oscar touched on this as well, they don't give workers information. I mean, we've been told nothing for months about what's going on in the workplaces. In other workplaces, we're sort of completely isolated. Well, rank and file committees will seek to establish and go out to other factories, other areas, and seek to unite with other workers to share information, share what's taking place, write on this, actually expose it, and undermine the attempts of management and the unions to isolate workers, because that's part of the problem. Workers feel very alone, really, and isolated, and there's nothing you can do. There's a certain conception there. Well, we've got to cut through that. We've got to fight that, and we've got to do that through the building of these organisations, because the union is doing the opposite, as we see in Smeaton Grange. Look, we have to fight amongst workers, and in building these rank and file committees, it's not an easy struggle. We have to fight to convince workers and draw out what's taking place, that there is an alternative. And what we're finding is that more and more workers are beginning to not only listen, but to really take up this fight. That's why we were able to establish this rank and file committee. And I think that's an important lesson, because the objective situation is now driving workers into struggle. Workers are confronted with face to face. I mean, look at Smeaton Grange, face to face with the true nature of capitalism. It's legal for employers to lock out their employees and do whatever they like, but as soon as workers take strike action, it's illegal. And certainly, we're not cowed by that. Workers, we have to build up our base, we have to build up our connections, and we have to organise workers to be able to take industrial and political actions in opposing the perspective of the unions and what they're attempting to carry out, and their supporters. Organisations like Solidarity, for example, and others, the pseudo-left, we're in struggle against all of these tendencies. So I think maybe that provides some answers to that question. Maybe someone else would like to answer some more.
Oscar, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I agree with those points. I mean, I think what we're talking about are organisations of, by, and for the workers themselves. I mean, you have a situation now, which is expressed very graphically at Smeaton Grange, where the corporations, the ruling elites, are carrying out sweeping pro-business restructuring. I mean, they're destroying jobs across multiple industries, whether you talk about the airlines, Telstra, Coles, Woolworths, and the chief enforcers of this agenda are the trade unions. I mean, these are not workers' organisations in any sense of the term. They're thoroughly corporatised. They work with governments, company managements on a daily basis against the workers that they falsely claim to represent. So what we're discussing are organisations that give expression to the immense opposition to this pro-business agenda among ordinary rank and file workers. I think, you know, the point about information is an important one. I mean, if you look at what the UWU has done throughout the Smeaton Grange dispute, which is replicated in really every other dispute that emerges, they seek to isolate workers factory by factory, plant by plant, to keep workers in the dark. I mean, clearly you can't fight what's being imposed by major corporations if you don't know what it is that's taking place. So I think one of the crucial roles that rank and file committees established, you know, in the United States, in education and elsewhere have taken up is to disseminate information throughout entire industries. I mean, if there are sackings at one auto plant, to ensure that auto workers throughout the country know about it and are apprised of its significance, mobilised against it. One of the, I mean, this can take different organisational forms. I mean, certainly the rank and file committees that we've created in the United States, that workers have created in the United States, have outlined definite demands, for instance, in education, a demand for the continuation of remote learning until that time that the pandemic is brought under control and it's safe to return to school, but many other demands posing or formulating the independent interests of workers against the companies, governments and the unions that represent them. I think just finally, I mean, the point that Jim raised about political perspective and program is really important. I mean, we're not talking about forming more militant unions, independent unions. I mean, these are committees of struggle involving rank and file workers. I mean, you would have representatives who would be subject to, you know, immediate recall by other workers as the committee grew. We're not talking about, you know, seeking to replicate the bureaucratised trade unions that exist, which are based entirely on a nationalist and pro-capitalist perspective. So the issue of an alternative perspective is raised very directly, and that is the perspective of fighting for a workers' government, for socialism. And in the case of Coles and Woolworths, I mean, you can't really oppose the closures that are being prepared without raising the need for public ownership, democratic workers' control of these warehouses. I mean, that's posed by the dispute itself. And I think that's the case across the board, but I'll just make those points.
We obviously have a lot of questions about rank and file committees, and for good reason. From Mohammed, could rank and file committees enjoy the same legal rights as unions? From Jenny, as I understand it, unions were not formed as revolutionary organisations, but reformist ones. Their job was to squeeze concessions out of reluctant big business. Those days of fighting through unions for social gain are over. Given that, would rank and file committees be able to accumulate strike funds through the diversion of union dues to the rank and file committee? Question 7 from Matthew. How does the SEP plan to get across to thousands of workers that are involved in the gig economy and workers who are working on the labour hire tax bracket? they are atomised? How do they form?
That's true, actually. That's a good point. That's a good point.
How do they form Soviets, rank and file committees and networks in the context of this frustrating and exacerbating situation?
Well, actually, that's an important question about the gig economy. There are tens of thousands of workers who are now being forced into these sort of industries. We see them all the time. When you're driving along, you can, pizza delivery, all the rest of it. And they are generally completely unorganized at the beck and call of their employers, and ruthlessly exploited. And really, those are the sort of conditions which they have to introduce into the working class in general. Certainly one of the things that's come up at Australia Post is the Uberization of Australia Post in terms of parcel delivery. We're no different to them. That's what workers sort of say, and it is a challenge. We do have to organise these sections of workers. Generally speaking, they're younger workers with very little experience, no connection to the organised trade union movement. Don't even recognise it or see it as a way of defending their conditions, which is, also an indictment of the unions and their refusal to organise these sections of workers. And I think that, certainly rank and file committees in these sections of workers, we would certainly be agitating and fighting, and we do, for workers to take up, the formation of such committees in order to organise themselves against this ruthless exploitation. For example, Amazon has now established that they will have people on call where you work for an hour. So if you register with them, you will have, in your sort of geo area, your where you live or wherever it is, they can then call you and say, look, there's 4 parcels for you to deliver in this area. If you go to this pickup point, you'll get the parcels and then you deliver, and you work for an hour, and people will be on call like this, constantly. These are the sort of conditions that are being talked about and introduced, and imposed, and the unions are doing nothing to fight this at all. And so I think that's an important question, and we do make an orientation to these sections of workers and fight to organise them in rank and file committees. Certainly, we have to give them a lead. And the rank and file committees that we're establishing at present will give these sections of workers a lead, and we have to write on the conditions that they confront, which are brutal and super exploitative. In terms of the legality, would we seek to make our rank and file committees legal? That's not our perspective. We're not seeking legality from the capitalist state. The unions already have that, and look what they do. Within the legal framework of within which they work, they are imposing, and that's what enterprise bargaining is about. That's what the Fair Work Commission's about. That is the legal framework, and it's a complete straitjacket. It's designed specifically to block any independent action and movement by the working class. As I said earlier, it's quite legitimate for employers to lock out their employees, and the Fair Work Commission, they don't say a word. They're quite happy for that to go ahead. But as soon as those workers take independent action against it, then they step in, and they say, no, you can't do that, and you can be arrested, you can be fined, and this is one of the things that the unions tell us every day. Certainly at Australia Post, they came down, well, we'd love to take industrial action, they said, against this ADM, but we can't. It's a legislative issue, and our hands are completely tied. And if you do, well, then you step outside the framework that's been established in the Fair Work Commission, and you're liable for, being fined and thrown in jail, all the rest of it, to cajole and to, block and to demoralise workers. This is it's an important issue. We have to fight against this, and we don't seek to make ourselves legal within that, to enter into that legal framework. No, we're fighting for, as Oscar said, the independent mobilisation and action of the working class. And I noticed comments about 1917 and the Russian Revolution and the fact that the workers there, the Bolshevik Party established rank and file committees to organize and lead the working class to overthrow capitalism. Ultimately, rank and file committees, as I said earlier, guided by a socialist internationalist perspective, will fight to unify the working class and establish a workers' government, where these industries are nationalized under workers' control, producing for the needs of workers and their families. And that's the task that we really confront. So I think just to answer those couple of questions.
I'd just like to make a couple of points, in particular in regards to the question from our friend on the bus. I think, excuse me if I've got your name wrong, but I think it was Robert, who raised whether the rank and file committees that we are referring to would be ones within the union and within the UWU and within other unions. The short answer is no. No, they wouldn't. The rank and file committees that we are fighting for are completely independent of and separate to the unions. They are not being proposed and established in order to pressure the unions. As I raised in regards to our pamphlets, the role of the unions and the betrayal of the unions does not emerge out of the low calibre, as they certainly are, of the trade union leaders. The calibre of the union leaders express the existence of the unions as police forces for the corporations, for companies. The role of rank and file committees, and certainly, and it's been highlighted by a point, that these are democratic institutions and one does not have to be a socialist to be a member or to create a rank and file committee. But what an independent committee would find itself confronted with is a situation where the fight to disseminate information, to inform workers of the truth about what is taking place, to appeal to workers outside of your own industry and also outside of the nation state, the national, outside Australian shores. The fight to develop nationwide industrial action in the defence of, in this case, Smeaton Grange, but other sections of workers that will confront attacks and job cuts in the very near future. That will come up against the capitalist state. That will come up against legislation which already is in existence. That legislation which was implemented and brought into existence by Labor governments with the support of the unions. And so the program of these rank and file committees will actually be very important. What a rank and file committee will have to confront is how it actually does defend its rights, the conditions of its workers, as we are seeing with the Chicago teachers in the United States. What the Biden administration, in office now for only a little over 2 weeks, is demanding, along with the Democratic Party and the governors of Illinois, is that teachers go back to face-to-face teaching under conditions where every reputable scientific study has shown that not only do children become infected, but they are also infectious. And teachers have found that they have, where this has been forced upon them in the United States, have contracted coronavirus and many have died. It is actually one of the issues that has emerged in New York with the Hunts Point workers, who like the Coles warehouse workers, were warehouse workers. They had confronted a situation, and this was one of the largest warehouses in the United States, where 400 of their colleagues had contracted coronavirus. 10 had died. And they were fighting for a $1 an hour wage increase. They confronted the full force of the Democratic Party, the New York state governors, the Biden administration, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came down to declare their support, but to actually try and get them to go back to work. And their struggle was defeated, because what a rank and file committee will confront is not just work, the issues that confront a workplace, but confront laws, confront politics, confront political parties. They will have to work out who are their friends and who aren't, who covers over for the union and who doesn't. Organisations like Solidarity Here, which raise all sorts of criticisms, raise certain muted criticisms of the union, but do not fight to develop this campaign outside of the union itself. What a rank and file committee in Coles would fight for is to broaden the struggles to Woolworths workers, to other sections of workers throughout Australia, including Australia Post and teachers and other layers of workers. That will come directly up against the state apparatus. So what the program of such rank and file committees would be are very, very important, and will be the difference between the ability of workers to unite, to defend themselves, which itself means a political struggle against capitalism. And so the question of a rank and file committee is yes, it is inherently and necessarily a democratic organisation. Workers have the right to raise whatever they want, to elect their leaders of the rank and file committee, and that those leaders would be subject to recall. But what they fight for, is something which is very important. And I would urge those in attendance to the meeting to actually read the perspective that was posted on January the 31st, and it's called Capitalism versus Socialism, the Pandemic and the Global Class Struggle. And what it outlines, and this is obviously in the context of the pandemic and in the United States itself, and in countries which are now subject to the catastrophic conditions of the pandemic, but it raises all the issues that pertain to the struggles which confront the working class as a whole. And what it raises is what capitalism puts forward and what a socialist program fights for. What the attitude of capitalism is to the pandemic, what the attitude of a socialist perspective is. And of course, in order to defend workers, in order that workers are able to not be subject, in this case, to infection and death by the pandemic, it means that non-essential industries need to be closed. What happens to those workers under conditions where they can't work? They have to be recompensed. Where does the money come from to recompense those workers? From the billions and trillions of dollars which has been handed over to capitalist companies, who have made an absolute killing as the death toll increases, The Wall Street stock markets, go up to record levels. The richest people on earth their wealth has increased at levels not seen before in history as the pandemic takes hold and workers die. So where do the resources come from? They have to come from the expropriation of these capitalists, of capitalist corporations, the major corporations, and provided to workers, to small businesses who are struggling and going out of business. So this perspective, while it is not pertaining immediately to a rank and file committee, but it does highlight the political program which such a committee would require to be carried out. I also want to draw your attention to a couple of other publications. One is what the Royal Commission into Australia's trade unions revealed. Now, that's this is a pamphlet that was written in 2016 by Will Fulgenzi, who is a writer for the World Socialist website, a young comrade who writes on international developments as well, and it is bound up with the analysis of the results of the Royal Commission. Now, we opposed this Royal Commission because it was instituted by the Abbott coalition government in 2014, 2015. It was part of not just an attack against the unions, but in fact against the working class as a whole. What it did, however, and this was something of a byproduct, because it was not as if either the Abbott government or any other government didn't know about the financial wheelings and dealings, the misappropriation of funds, the manoeuvrings, the machinations which the unions carry out. It's not as if they didn't know that, and their opposition and hostility to the unions is not because of the financial misdealings which union bureaucrats and administrations carry out. And so what it did do, however, was drew out and revealed more openly than had been done before some of the role and the financial situation which exists with the unions. As I said, it was published on the World Socialist website in 2016. It's available now. It's $5, but it's also available from Mehring.com. Finally is the publication that I want to draw your attention to, which is the Historical and International Foundations of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia. And this is a very important publication. It was adopted by the founding Congress of the SEP Australia in January of 2010. It is in that sense, the founding document of our party, the SEP, which was founded as I said, in 2010, and its predecessor, the Socialist Labour League, founded in 1972, is the Trotskyist movement in Australia and is affiliated to the International Committee of the Fourth International. It reviews and examines the critical political experiences of the Australian working class throughout the 20th century. And it does so, obviously, within the context of the global economic and political processes underway and of the experiences of the international working class. It is the theoretical and political basis of the struggle for socialism in this country. And I would certainly urge anyone who doesn't have a copy of it to also purchase this. It's $12. I want to now take the opportunity to call for donations for our monthly fund. Every month we raise $25,000. This is in order to create the conditions for the work that we have to undertake. The development of the World Socialist website, and of course the relaunch of the World Socialist website in October 2020, which has transformed, I think, the accessibility to our analysis, as well as to the historical and theoretical legacy of our movement. The relaunch, which of course is a work in progress, has enabled our readers to be able to access the analysis of the Trotskyist movement, the Fourth International of Leon Trotsky itself, and of course of the Fourth International, the International Committee. We raise our funds only from the working class, from our members, from our supporters, from our readers. We get no state funding, we get no sponsorship from corporations or unions or anything else. Our resources are sourced wholly and solely from you. And so we want to ask you again to donate as generously as you possibly can. There will be a donation slide that will come up very quickly, I'm hoping, in which you can donate. If you do, I'd like to ask you to put in the chat that how much you have donated, so that we can give a running total of our collection. All right, there is another question, and that is, what are the concrete steps we can take or have taken to assist Coles workers? Which is a good question.
I can make a couple of brief points. I think one of the things that we have to do is to really break the wall of silence surrounding what's taking place at Smeaton Grange. As we said, this was a major stand against the company, against the union, against these attempts to force through a sellout deal. Under immense pressure to vote yes, the workers voted no in defence of not only their own jobs and conditions, but those of warehouse workers and the working class as a whole. I think it's very significant that ballot, which was just on Tuesday, the no vote, has not been reported on by a single corporate publication, by the Australian ABC, the state-funded broadcaster. It's as though there's a D notice on this, and the union itself hasn't even created a Facebook post or a post on their website about the rejection of this agreement. I think what this is about is that they're seeking to further isolate the Smeaton Grange workers, but they're also fearful of this becoming a rallying point for broader opposition within the working class. So I think there are numbers of things that can be done. Clearly, we'd ask that you share and spread our analysis of the situation at Smeaton Grange. The statement we referenced was published on January 27th, calling for rank and file committees. But I think more broadly, we are raising, the necessity for workers everywhere to come to the aid of the workers at Smeaton Grange. There should be, rank and file meetings at all workplaces to discuss the dispute there, its significance, how the union sellout can be defeated. And I think, more broadly, what's posed is that, what's taking place at Smeaton Grange is occurring or being prepared at every workplace. There is a vast pro-business restructuring taking place in this country as internationally. And what is posed very directly is the need for workers to begin organising independently through rank and file committees. But I think, as we've sought to stress, above all, to begin considering and turning to a new political perspective, which rejects the subordination of society, social life to the profit demands of corporations, and which insists on the social rights of workers to a permanent full-time job, decent free public health care, education, etc. You know, none of which is compatible with capitalism. So I'll just make those points.
Cheryl, there's a question in the chat that says that the unions will seek to blacklist workers who take up a struggle to form rank and file committee. How will this committee deal with this sort of situation? I think it's an important question because, you know, workers, you know, the union does everything to intimidate them. And without a perspective to fight that, it becomes very difficult and enormous pressure is brought to bear. But I think in answering this question, I think one can look historically. And recently we held a memorial meeting for Comrade Barry Jobson, who along with Terry Cook worked and formed the LCAR, were part of the LCAR Chilora shop committee. And they on many occasions confronted the slanders and attacks by the Stalinists, you know, who denounced them for the principled struggle that they undertook to defend jobs and conditions. And I think if you take a leaf out of their book, one can see that, you know, they never ever accepted or simply, you know, rolled over, if you like, you know, against any of the attacks that these forces launched against them. And in fact, did the opposite. They launched on many occasions, and I remember, principled struggle amongst workers, other sections of workers, to clarify, to expose the slanders and the lies that the bureaucrats carried out, and also carried out in the course of that, sought to build their own, you know, build support for the shop committee and for the fight that they were undertaking. And, you know, more often than not, what would happen is that these forces would be silenced, they'd be forced to retract their slanders, or they just stood completely exposed as liars and traitors. And, you know, this was important political work, because we're certainly going to come up against, you know, the similar type of attacks, and we already have actually in the work at Australia Post. You know, we reported on one of our supporters putting forward a motion just to call for a mass meeting, and he was, you know, denounced by the union. But this immediately, we immediately went on the offensive. You know, we wrote about this, we exposed what they said. We then campaigned throughout Australia Post and handed out our material, which then clarified and informed workers about what was taking place. And, you know, they were put very much, and in the workplace itself, these forces were very much forced to retreat and were not able to carry out a victimization, or which they would have liked, and attempt to silence us, and they haven't been able to at all. So I think the other aspect of this is that, look, that they have to resort to these sort of methods because they are completely weak. They're doing this from a tremendously weak standpoint. Now, when I'm talking about Barry and Terry Cook, you know, they carried out these struggles. This was in the 90s and the 80s. Now, you know, here we are in the 2000s, 2020, and in fact, the position of these forces has declined much further. You know, I mean, they are they have many less members now, these and, you know, do not command anywhere near the sort of support that they commanded even back then. So, you know, they are operating from an extremely weak position. We can certainly expect these type of attacks, but we're also prepared. You know, we have a clear perspective, and we're fighting to, you know, clarify as many workers as we possibly can. So just.
There is one more question, which I think it's Kirsten that has raised. Elaborate a bit more on the benefits that technology can provide for workers rather than being used by corporations against workers. how, in that sense, how would a socialist society do that? What would be the attitude of socialism to the development of technology? So, Oscar, did you want to take that one up?
Yeah, I can make some points. I think, I mean, the essential issue is that the reason that workers at Coles and elsewhere are facing job destruction is not because of automation or technological development as a thing in itself. I mean, they're facing the job destruction because that's the agenda of the capitalist class, because that's the governing principle of bourgeois society. Everything is subordinated to the profits of the banks, the major corporations, rival corporations that are in a relentless race to the bottom to slash labour costs, to get a competitive advantage, all at the expense of workers. But I think it's a very important point. I mean, technological development, improvements in productivity actually lay the foundations for a higher form of social organisation, that is for socialism. We now have a world economy that's been brought into being by the labour of the international working class, and resources, productive forces that can house, clothe, feed the world's population comfortably. The issue is that those productive forces, those resources, are under the control of a tiny minority of society, the billionaires, the financial oligarchs, who have greatly increased their wealth over the past year, amid a pandemic, mass suffering, etc. In terms of what would take place under socialism, I mean, production would not be organised solely to make private profit. I mean, the governing principle of society would be social need. And if you look at developments in automation, in the warehousing and many other sectors, if these industries were publicly owned, democratically controlled by the working class itself, you could have a reduction in the number of hours that workers labour each day without any lowering of their pay, vast improvements in conditions, safety, and a society in which workers did not have to toil 10 or more hours a day in a warehouse, which is increasingly the case. They'd have the ability to pursue culture, leisure, etc., and definite social rights, including to a permanent full-time job, decent free healthcare, education, all of which is under attack under capitalism. So I think, the point is, if the vast resources which have been created by the labour of the working class were reappropriated by society, were taken over and placed under the control of working people, there would be more than enough, to ensure full-time jobs, all of the social rights and needs of workers. Let's make that point.
Thanks, Oscar. Look, I think we have had a lot of questions, and I think they have been actually really very important and helpful ones, as well as comments. But I think we will wrap it up now. I mean, before we finish, however, I do want to remind everybody that there is an online public meeting being conducted by the Socialist Equality Party in the United States. It's called Capitalism versus Socialism, the Pandemic and the Global Class Struggle. And it is on, to outline both the significance of the events of the last year, because it is now a year since the outbreak of the pandemic. As I said, there's more than 2.3 million people who have died, 450,000 in the United States alone. There's now more virulent, more infectious strains which are now spreading throughout the world. And the possibility is that the pandemic could actually worsen. What the working class confronts on an international scale is the most historic and profound political issues. I mean, this is, you know, a situation of barbarism or socialism, and the programmatic questions that are arising out of the experience of the international working class of the pandemic is profound, and that's what will be discussed on Monday. Now, it's because it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, it becomes 5 o'clock in the morning, the fresh time of 5 o'clock in the morning on Monday morning. But I would urge everybody to attend if you possibly can. And finally, the main purpose in that sense of holding these meetings, of clarifying to workers the issues that are confronting the working class on an international scale, is to fight, as Trotsky says, to resolve the crisis of revolutionary leadership. There will be class struggle. There will be an upsurge. In fact, that is already developing. But without a leadership, without a political leadership with a perspective that is able to mobilise, clarify and provide the perspective for which the working class can overthrow capitalism, then the chances are that those struggles will be defeated. When capitalism exists, it will find a way of resolving its problems, which is why it is the historic task of the working class, the gravedigger of capitalism, to carry through that responsibility, and that is the overthrow of capitalism. To do that means making a stand, joining our movement, fighting to build this leadership, to resolve that crisis, and to build the organisations of the International Committee of the Fourth International to carry through the overthrow of capitalism. So I would urge you to do that, but in doing that, I thank you for your attendance, for your participation, for your questions, for your donations, and we will see you at the next meeting. Thank you very much.